Hi, welcome back. We are going to be talking now a little bit about why it is that popularity is so important. How come this is something that is affecting us so much when we are young? And how come it's something we seem to kind of gravitate towards for the rest of our lives? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. One thing I'm going to point out is the idea that this has become really explicit. Have you ever noticed recently if you are on the web, there is a lot of information about what's trending, whether you're on Twitter or whether you are just even looking at a news story or anything you see. Here's something you see these graphics that talk about how many times has story been tweeted, or how many people have liked it on Facebook, or how many comments are there, and often that's right at the top of the story. In fact, even after you are done reading the story, there may be those icons again. Encouraging you should tweet about it, you should like it on Facebook. Why is it happening? We've kind of almost grown accustomed to it. I think one of the reasons why this is happening is because it's based on this fundamental premise. That if we see that a lot of people are really interested in something, we will think somehow it's good, it's important. We want to do what everyone else is doing, even if we receive that idea and we think, no, I'm an individual, I don't just conform. Still, we are kind of a bit influenced by that. We think, well, if that's something that 3,000 other people have liked, then it must be something really important that I need to look at. It's the same thing when you watch a commercial and they say this is a #1 movie at the box office. They're really trying to pull on the idea that it's popular and therefore that means it's good. But why does it work so well? Why do we even care about the fact that everyone else is doing? I want to read the news stories that I think are of interest to me. And I don't think my interests are going to be the same as 10,000 other people that read the same news story. So, why would I automatically think that that's important? It turns out that a lot of this might have to do with the way that we developed as a species. And the way that we can think about that is we took a step way back and thought about this from an evolutionary perspective. So let's go back to the world of cavemen and cavewomen and really thought about what life was like at that time, because it's how we developed the brains we have today. Even though that's a long time ago, that's not very long ago from the perspective of our biological development. So there are lots of ways that what happened back then, it's still influencing us today, and it's still influencing how our brains work. So, have you ever noticed how if you are young, then other people around you will yawn? Yawns are kind of contagious. Or have you ever heard that when women live together in close quarters or spend a lot of time together, their menstrual cycles will start to synchronize? That all has to do with the same idea here. It's a sense that when we were cave people a long time ago, we quickly learned that we are going to do a lot better if we live together. And if we kind of pay attention to signals from each other. So, if you think about it, if you went out on your own, well, you would have a hard time getting food, right? And if you got food and you kill something like a giant wild beast or whatever, you are not going to be able to eat all of that all by yourself. So it's really inefficient. And if you are trying to save the rest of it, it's going to spoil and you are going to get sick and die, and evolutionary you are going to be weeded out. So we really learned that when it comes to food, same as safety, protecting one another. Or when it comes to other ways of coordinating activities, like when we should all go to sleep. That way we can all go to the next part of. We are a nomadic group, so that helps us to get the next part of where we are trying to move on. It would be good if that was all synchronized, and we were in a herd and we were learned to be a herd. And the more you stay in the herd, the more you sleep when everyone sleeps. That way we can all work together and move together at the same time. The more that everyone stops to give birth or to conceive new babies. That should all happen at the same time. We should all eat together, we should all protect each other, and if you are living that herd, then those things will be threatened. You won't get food, you won't be safe, you won't stop at the same time as others, and you might get kicked out. You might be alone, you might be unsafe, and that's not good for you. The people that did that, they were weeded out through natural selections. We are all people that survived by learning to pay attention to what we heard has to say. It turns out that has had a really cool, indelible effect on how our brains are put together. But we just recently discovered this in ways that we kind of didn't even expect. So, there have been a lot of researchers that have been interested in understanding how the brain works. And in particular, there have been a lot of people that have looked at how the brain kind of lights in an fMRI, let's say when we experience pain. So, what I mean by that is there have been a lot of studies where they have asked people to lay down in fMRIs. That's kind of laying there, and they show them a screen over their head, and they give them an opportunity to experience some types of stimuli. Now, in some cases, those might be real stimuli. So while their hand is sticking out of the fMRI, they might get a little prick or some sort of painful stimulus. And when that happens, the fMRI would allow them to see what areas of the brain are kind of lighting up. And what we learned was very reliable for a very long time we've seen in research. That there are particular areas that tell us that we are experiencing pain, and the areas that tell us it's the time to start regulating this pain and doing something about it. Now the parts of our brains that signal pain is really important because the pain in our ways of it's brain's way of telling us something very serious is happening and you need to do something about it. This is going to threaten your survival, so pain is kind of the most powerful signal that our brain can give us. To tell us that if we don't do something soon, we may die or our species may be in trouble. Well, an interesting thing happens. So there were some researchers, including Naomi Ersenbeck from UCLA, who decided to do some studies looking at people in the fMRI machine in the magnet. And they asked them to, instead of getting real pain, they asked them to participate in some interactions where they were getting included by others. And the way that this worked was sometimes there were real people that folks were communicating with while they were in the magnet. And sometimes they were just pretend. But either way, the experimenters put it together so the person in the fMRI magnet saw that they were being included and that others were choosing not to interact with them. So, in a way, it was kind of like that we were getting a signal saying you are getting kicked out of the herd. You are not part of the group anymore, you are getting excluded. It turns out that we were very surprised to find that when people got the signals to say that they were getting included, the parts of their brain that lit up were the parts of the brain that light up when we experience real physical pain. And this kind of led to the idea that there might be something called social pain. We experience social exclusion in the exact same way that we experience physical pain. In fact, there is even a research to say that if you take a Tylenol, then that helps your social pain go down. just like it helps your physical pain go down. So maybe this is why even the way that we say it in English, our language tends to mirror the idea of pain. We talk about heartbreak or homesickness. It's the idea that we experience physical symptoms from a social rejection experience. So it kind of suggests that there is some way that we lack of popularity makes us experience pain. And our brain is telling us with its most powerful signals, you need to do something about this. Don't get kicked out of the hurt. Make sure that you are safe. It turns out that there's some other research also that has to do with our DNA that found that this is even more powerful than we even realized. But before we talk about that, I just have to tell you briefly about something that's really new, and it's the idea of epigenetics. Epigenetics is really the sense that while we all have our DNA and every single cell in our bodies has DNA in its nucleus. That DNA, not every gene is turned on. Some genes turn on later and some genes never turn on. But what we have recently learned in epigenetics is that sometimes what makes those cells turn on certain DNA is something that happens in our environment. So, believe it or not, someone could walk in the room, they could say hello to you, or they could say something not pleasant to you that kind of rejects you. And what will actually affect what's happened in our cells. And the reason why this is important is because, as you probably know, many of our cells are dying every second, and new cells are growing every second. So, if an experience happens to you now, the cells that will start growing 2 seconds from now and going to start relying on the DNA that was activated, but what happened to you before. In fact, it's been suggested that every 6 months or so we are the person that is reactive to what happened to us and those prior cells about 6 months ago. So we are constantly renewing people that are living through epigenetics base on what happened to us months before. It turns out our social experience have an incredibly important impact on the DNA. So for the same reasons we talked out before with heartening and with our evolutionary legacy. We've learned that if something happens to us that makes us feel rejected, then our bodies turns on specific DNA. And the DNA they turn on has to do with our physical health. So again, let's think again about cave people. If you were a person that was living back in those times, one of the things that happened when you lived with others is you found that you got a lot of colds. And the reason why it's because viruses spread from human to human. So as long as you are interacting with other people, your DNA is activated to develop immunity to viruses, and all of the genes that helps us to resist viruses are upregulating. In other words, they are kind of turn on. If you were part of a herd, there was much less of a chance that a dinosaur was going to come and eat your arm off. Therefore, you wouldn't have to have all of the inflammatory types of responses in your body to quick heal that bleeding limb and keep you to survive. You wouldn't need that kind of pro-inflammatory protection as much. Well, what happens in the minute we get rejected by others, we actually find that the genes that helps us resist viruses become downregulated. In fact, you can take a blood test 40 minutes later and that finds that you can see the signs of that so quickly. Meanwhile, the inflammatory responses all upregulate. So of course, if something happens to you for 1 minute today, that doesn't mean you're going to have an inflammatory disease necessarily. But if you experience chronic rejection, over so much time you experience ways of feeling that you are not part of the herd. You are not someone that is expected and popular. Then over time your cells will continually develop this upregulated inflammatory response. So it turns out that popularity is actually changing the way that our DNA expresses. This has major implications for health, and it turns out that there is a way that has a feedback loop into our brains, and if even changes your mood and your experience too. And we'll talk about more of that later. So in summary, it's important to remember that one of the reasons why we seem to care so much about popularity is that our species, though about being in the herd, is something we need for safety. And the minute that we lose popularity, our body is preparing us for what will happen when we are kicked out of the herd. And our brain is telling us with its most powerful signal, you are needed to do something to fix it. Go back to others. Do what you can and be part of the group. And that's really important. Our DNA is changing. This is all very adaptive. But unfortunately, it's not really helpful for us today in the millennium that we live with now. You can go out for a fun walk on your own and not get eaten by a dinosaur. So unfortunately, our bodies are helping us in a way that would have been useful millions of years ago. But it's not necessarily helpful in today's society. And that's some of the reasons why popularity plays such a huge role today. But it has effects on us that aren't necessarily what we would have wished for.